For our next few minutes here, I'm going to walk us through kind of 5 ideas in pretty short order, and try to make a case for us to be thinking through what I've come to be persuaded by a guy at our church named Larry, who's talked with me about this book a little bit the last few weeks, is the theme or the thesis of this book. Is really summarized in these verses of this first part that we've looked at. So I really think that everything else that we study in James can fit under the umbrella of what we've already just looked at here tonight. So in some ways you're like, man, I don't have to come to the rest of the study. Like I did the main part, that's good. Here's what I'm going to walk us through. And then also, just so you know, in some of the follow-up emails, I'll probably just include a PDF of my slides, because I know some people really like taking notes, and that way you don't have to be like, you didn't leave it up long enough. Don't worry, I'll send it out. You'll have the information if you want it. So a few things we're going to walk through. I think joy looks like worship. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Joy looks like resistance to despair. Third, we're going to look at how perseverance and hardship produces maturity. And then I want us to start thinking in that twofold manner that James is going to be bringing up in our minds, this is something that we do and also something that happens to us, right? There's faith and there's deeds. It's both. There's something that God does in us, and there's also something that we're required to do. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And that's why Adam designed all the 3 squares that way, right? You have deeds and you have faith, and you have in the middle, you have to have both of them together for a vibrant faith. And so we're going to see how maturity is something that we do, and maturity is also something that happens to us. Okay, so let's just walk through the passage again. I'm going to read it one more time for us. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. This language for pure joy, some other translations, I don't totally know why they use the word pure there, because it's probably more just a word like all joy, like consider it all joy. So it's not necessarily talking about like a quality of joy, as though there could be like pure joy and impure joy. It's more like just consider it all joy. And so one of the things I want us to be thinking about first is that this language of joy in our mind, when we hear the word joy, I think our like default reaction is to think of it in a similar way to happiness. And so they're not the same thing. And yet when we think of joy, if someone says, wow, that person's filled with joy, they usually are picturing something like happiness. They seem like a happy person. But this word here for joy is probably better, like it's a great word for it, but the sense it's supposed to be communicating to us is this idea of worship. Like consider it still worthy to be worshiped through. Like consider it still worth worshiping in light of all of the hardships and trials that you face. So rather than it being about a happiness or a emotion that we feel, it's a action we're encouraged to do. So joy is something that can be done in that sense while feeling sad. So an emotion could be sadness, but the action could be joy. And so I think that perspective of joy will look like worship is a helpful way for us to kind of see why is it that James is framing this whole thing the way he is. Secondly, joy, I think, looks like resistance to despair. And that's what I think is that idea of taking on this posture of worship, because you have, to link it in with what we talked about yesterday, like because we know the story of who Jesus is, and we know what he's accomplished for us, regardless of what our particular context or circumstances actually give us in our life, it is still reason for us to resist feeling despair about what's ahead of us. So I want to quote for us a guy named John Swinton. This will not be the last time I quote from him. He's one of my favorite thinkers. He has a great book called Finding Jesus in the Storm, and the subtitle is The Spiritual Lives of Christians with Mental Health Challenges. John Swinton has been a chaplain for years, dealing with different, in the medical system, dealing with different things. So if you're interested in the world of aging or mental health, or particularly he's done a lot of work on dementia. I know that dementia hits a lot of our families one way or another at different times. So John Swinton would be a great resource to Google if you are working through things to do with dementia or Alzheimer's. He has this quote in this book. Well, first he quotes another theologian. So this is like Inception quotation, right? There's like layers of quotes. So Swinton says, the Yale theologian Willie Jennings defines joy this way. Joy is an act of resistance against all the forces of despair. Joy is a work that can become a state which can become a way of life. And now here's Swinton reflecting on that. He says, finding joy, being able to celebrate the goodness of Jesus even during horrendous struggles, is an act of resistance that stands firmly against those powers and principalities that desire nothing but despair for human beings. It's a collective work that involves spiritual formation. And as we engage in worship, we become people who embody joy. And as we embody joy, it becomes a way of life. And then he says, joy is not the outcome of resistance. We do not struggle against despair so that we can find joy. Joy is the key point of resistance within the struggle. I think it's a really helpful way to frame it. This idea that joy itself isn't a result of something else. Joy is that very act of, in the midst of the hard thing, I'm going to continue to resist the point of despair. So we have joy in trials. I think that's clear from our passage that you guys have been looking at, that's what he's about. That's what he's writing about in these first few verses. And joy looks like resistance to despair. So in that way, if we combine these first two thoughts, we can think about joy is a worshipful resistance to despair. This is one of the reasons why, even though throughout, like forever, for as long as there are going to be Christians deciding to gather together in worship, there are going to be opinions about the songs we sing. That's just like, until the Lord returns, we're going to have thoughts, right? And we all have them, and that's great. But the reason why, even if we don't love the songs that are being sung, or if we do love the songs that are being sung, the reason that we continue to sing together is that singing actually does something in our brains and in our bodies different than just this kind of communication. There's actually something that happens in singing that does have a forming effect on us. And so that's why Paul, in some of his letters, he says, encourage one another by singing. Because there's actually, you would think encourage one another by teaching, is what he would say, right? But no, he says encourage one another through psalms and spiritual songs. Because there's actually something to the very act of singing and seeing other people sing that actually encourages you. That's why I think one of the best spiritual disciplines we can have is, even if you don't feel it, go through the motions and sing the songs. Because you might not be feeling in that moment a particular love of that particular chorus, but someone might observe you singing, and I don't know if that's ever happened to you in a worship service, when you have witnessed someone else engaging the Lord in song, and it's actually done an encouraging work in you. If that's happened to you, it's because I think this is kind of what Swinton's getting at. It's this idea that worship itself, and there are more ways to worship than just singing, to be clear, but worship is a way in which we actually resist despair itself. And that, I think, is what joy is. Okay, thirdly, perseverance and hardship produces maturity. This is something that I think is really clear from this text. James is going to be a fun book to study because it's not confusing. It's simple, but it's so difficult. And that's annoying because it would be better if it was hard. Then we could be like, who knows what he means, Tough. Let's just go on with our life. But James is like, let me make it plain, and it's going to hurt. And we will not be able to leave the book of James, I think, week by week without thinking to ourselves, oh my gosh, do I need the Spirit of God to work in me, to create in me this kind of thing that James is talking about. And so it's clear in these verses to consider it joy. Consider all the things joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. This idea of the hard is good. And again, that can be a thing that we cognitively are okay to give like head nod service to, right? The hard can be good for us. And it's one of those things that we need to remind ourselves of that truth before the hard things come, so that when the hard things come, we can remind ourselves that God will not waste pain. God refuses to waste the hardships of our life. He's very effective at using the hard things in our life for our good. It doesn't make the hard things good, but God will use the hard things for our good. They actually develop a perseverance. There's a resistance training that takes place. This is actually, in my mind, one of the reasons why I think going through the homework and going through the process of answering the easy questions and then answering some of the harder questions and actually wrestling with the text is how we're going to learn. I'm persuaded that there's no amount of like just sitting passively listening to good sermons that will help us grow in our understanding of the Word of God. We have to have that wrestle with it ourselves. So I'm all for good preaching, right? Good preaching is better than bad preaching. And there's something special that happens in the room by the Spirit of God through the act of preaching, that there have been so many times where someone will come up to me and be like, oh man, this thing that you said, and it meant this to me, and it really encouraged me, and then they leave, and I was like, I did not mean to say that. But I'm so glad your faith is encouraged because of what you heard, right? And that's just what the Spirit of God does, is he takes words in a sermon and he applies it into the hearts of people. So I'm all for good preaching. But I don't think preaching is actually the best way for us to learn the scriptures together, because there has to be some resistance training to it. There has to be this point of it's called cognitive dissonance, this point where in your mind you think to yourself, well, that's not what I thought to be true. That's not how I've seen it before. And this is one of those places where hardship is going to be the thing that makes us that language of complete, of not lacking anything, of what God is trying to do. That language of mature is that language of something coming to its fruition point, its culmination point, like the reason why it exists, right? The mature car is the car that you can turn on and it can actually drive. That's a mature car. And God says that hardship is going to make us mature. And then finally, these final 2 points about this kind of dual thing that James talks about quite a bit, this faith and works. I think maturity is something that we do, and it's also something that happens to us. So first, I'm going to take us to another passage to see how maturity is something that we do. Here's Colossians 3, a great text. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all of these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. So I don't have to persuade you, I think, from the passage that James is about our coming into maturity of who God has made us to be. And this language of maturity is all about growing into the likeness of Jesus. That's what it's after. I hope that us talking about that at our tables, that's one of the answers we got. What's the point of it? It's maturity in Christ likeness. So what Paul now is saying in this passage to the church in Colossae is he's listing a bunch of traits that look like Jesus. Like the goal of, if we continue to mature in our faith, these kinds of things will be true of us. Compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with others, forgiving others. And if they have a grievance, if we have a grievance against someone, forgiving others. Those are all things that should over time increasingly be true of us if we are becoming more and more mature in the likeness of Christ. But what's fascinating to me about this passage is Paul uses the language of clothing, that this is something that we do. So his encouragement here is that maturity is actually something that we do. We decide to put the clothes on of these things. So in the two kind of equal truths that James is going to get after for us, that stuff happens to us by God's Spirit, and also we need to do things by God's Spirit. We actually work on our own maturity, and part of that is in different moments when we are tempted to be not compassionate, and when we're tempted to be not kind, and to be arrogant, and to insist on our own way, or to be abrasive, or to be impatient. Those moments are opportunities for us because we feel the chill in the air of sin to clothe ourselves with Christ. And instead of just being like, what did you expect me to do? That person always says that, and I always respond this way. It just always happens. No, you felt the air, you felt the cold air, and you had the opportunity to either not clothe yourself or clothe yourself. And we're going to hear from James over and over again, you have actions to do here. And so Paul here is saying, actually, this fascinates me that Paul links maturity with something that we do for ourselves. So the next time we're tempted to lash out at someone in anger, or to be impatient with someone who is trying our patience, or to insist on our own way, instead of just thinking to ourselves, well, how can I respond differently? We have to remind ourselves that actually we have a closet full of virtues, that the Spirit of God is like, just put that on. Give it a try. And also, maturity is something that happens to us. So this is, again, James is using that language of maturity. I don't have to drag that out. But here's Paul in another letter, very similar words. And this time he talks about it as the fruit of the Spirit being love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So like the overlap of the Venn diagram of those two lists is basically just one circle, right? And yet in one passage, Paul is like, hey, put on that clothing. Put on that patience. Put on that compassion. Put on that kindness. And in this passage, he's saying, yeah, it'll just grow. Like the Spirit of God is just going to produce that in you. It will. He will produce that character in you. So that's why, again, the call out to the logo. I hope you can. This will actually be true of all of us. That we take faith seriously. We take deeds seriously. We take God's work in us seriously. We take our actions and responsibilities seriously, and that as those two things overlap one another, we see what it looks like to actually live in discipleship to Jesus. And so that's really what the book of James is about. It's about a faith that's going to work. And so we're going to be engaging with that week in, week out, sometimes little passages, sometimes big passages, but every single week we're going to be looking at that duality of both God doing the work and us being expected to do the work, that he will grow the fruit, and also we need to put on the clothing, that there will be times when it will be easy to come to church and to sing the songs with passion and boldness, and there will be times when we just have to go through the motions. And both of those are evidences of God's work in our life. And both of those are evidences of us taking our discipleship to Jesus seriously. So James is going to force us to say a lot of both and, rather than saying either or. And it's going to be really frustrating. And God will probably make us more like Jesus through it, right? Okay, so let's spend some time talking at our tables for the next 20 minutes. And so just walk through some of these questions, some of the language that I used before. You can debate if you think it was helpful or not. You can talk about what you find easier to lean towards. Some of us are more happy to lean towards the language that we do something, and others of us are more happy to lean towards the language that God does it in us. I think we all have a natural bent towards one or the other that we're more comfortable in. So I think it's just helpful to own that. And then there's a question on page 5 that I think would be helpful for all of us to just wrestle with as we go through the rest of the series. Okay? Okay, have a great